Hi folks. You'll remember last week I took a look at the vintage science fiction cover art from my collection, my favourite ones. And for me, this is a large part of the joy of reading and collecting vintage science fiction. And at the end of that video, I asked you all to send me your favourite cover art. And if enough of you did, then we would be able to have a look at them. And I'm pleased to say that enough of you did do exactly that. And so we've got some really cool cover art to look at. I'm just going to show them on the screen, I think, and talk over them so you don't get distracted by my handsome visage, which would only be natural, of course. The cover art is the star of the show. And with all of that said, let's get stuck in. Andrew Helm has these delights to share. All of them are Telsey Idon books and not an author or series that I've ever read. But judging solely by the covers, I can see why Andrew might like them. We've got 2 copies of The Lion Game, one with a fast-moving, alien-looking red lion thing. That's this one, and another with a very foxy looking lady, which we'll get to in a minute. The red lion is pretty kinetic. It can clearly shift and it looks pretty fierce too. I like the sense of motion that the artist has conjured into the image. Onto the foxy lady then. I imagine it's Telsey herself, perhaps, and there's a caged beast behind her, although when I first looked at this picture, I thought that caged beast was a floating, very fierce-looking pumpkin, but that's just its nose, apparently. If you look more closely, you can see that. And also when I first looked at it, I thought that she was looking thoughtfully at her mobile phone, but no, it's a gun. So we've got a gun, a foxy looking lady with a really sexy outfit, and a killer pumpkin. And so teenage me is very happy with this cover. Then we've got 3 different editions of the Telsey toy, which I gather from the covers is a collection of 4 stories. I've been wondering what the Telsey toy is. Different, one assumes, from a sex toy. And I can hear Andrew getting cross with me now. How dare I cheapen the blessed Telsey with such smutty innuendo? Well, apologies, Andrew. Anyway, the first one is rather abstract. I initially thought it was some kind of plant, a vine or something snaking across the screen, but on closer inspection I think it's actually made up of little green people, women I think, some of them contorted into uncomfortable looking poses. It's most odd. I'll try and zoom in so you can see. Then the second edition of this book, an ace this time, has Telsey staring down a few alien creatures, including a 4-eyed alien elephant type thing. In fact, there's an abundance of eyes in that little group. The cat thing has 3, as does the chicken-footed, bubble-headed red thing next to it. Aye, aye, Captain. In the next edition, Telsey this time is in the grip of a giant of some kind, presumably featuring in one of the stories. Fee, fi, fo, fum. Next, still from Andrew, we have what I thought was a particularly perky-looking Telsey, but perhaps it was cold out, with a demonic tint to her eyes. And to complete the look, she has a pair of saber-toothed beasties with her, and they all look very fierce, not somebody that you'd want to mess with. Looking altogether more chilled in this edition of the same book, Telsey is relaxing here in a bucolic scene with a grumpy-looking saber-toothed cat on her lap. I suppose Telsey looks a bit grumpy too, but then she would if the universe was against her. Brian from Ontario, Canada sent a few to me as well. And first up is Bug-Eyed Monsters, which looks to be an anthology of short stories in the Panther in this edition. I also have the just the art version without the title, which is a bit clearer. So let's look at that. Yes, that is much better. That's rather magnificent, isn't it? It's very colourful, a beautiful horse-faced man-bug thing, which I think is exactly the look that the artist was looking for. I really like the way that he's got the iridescence on the wing and on the green of the head and the torso, which does look very insectoid indeed. This next one, though, is absolutely fabulous. And I've stared and stared at this, and I really don't know what to make of it. The poor lady, I think it's a lady, has been blessed with tremendous, let's call them chesty accoutrements. And lucky her, but then things seem to have got confused in the art department as there's been some outsized facial sensory organs merged in. Someone's been on the magic mushrooms. In his email to me, Brian described it as Dali-esque, and it does have that ring about it. I wonder if Dali moonlighted as a science fiction cover artist. And if not, I wonder what went through the artist's mind as they were deciding what to draw. It should be a woman, and she should be naked, obviously. This is a vintage science fiction book after all. But I know, even better, I'll put a giant nose and an ear on top instead of her head and shoulders. Yes, that'll be great. I'm most intrigued to know whether the illustration bears any relation at all to the story. It's bonkers stuff. Brian also sent me this unusual cover, which is in landscape format, which is not something you see very often. I assume it's only the cover and that the text is in its usual vertical orientation. I like it, although it's given me a crick in the neck looking at it. Let's turn it round for a moment. Yes, that's a bit better. The last of the covers that Brian sent me is an old Asimov, and I think it's maybe a magazine cover or possibly an abridged novella or something. But anyway, the 1,000-Year Plan definitely formed part of what became the Foundation fix-up. So I imagine that's Harry Seldon on the cover, and it's rather splendid. and there are definitely no nose, ear, boob arrangements this time, which is maybe a shame. I can't unsee that cover now that I've seen it. Joe, who presumably lives in Germany, sent me some German science fiction covers, just to mix things up a bit. The first up is Jack Vance's Killing Machine, or Die Mordmaschine, which looks like some kind of death robot gone mad. I like the colour of the background, and the robot looks like some kind of armoured, demented food processor. And it just wants to make that fella into a breakfast smoothie. Run! Oh, he is running. Run faster! Next we have some dick in the form of Vulcan's hammer, which is, I think, our first spaceship of the day. And it's about time too. Again with the bright colours. I like that one. Joe also sent me an Edmund Hamilton Captain Future story this time. Face of the Deep, or Planetoid of Death in German, which is an altogether more dramatic title, I think you'll agree. I love this one too, because there are spaceships. The last one from Joe is a John Brunner, Web of Everywhere, or Verbotener Codierungen, in my terrible pronunciation, with the literal translation of which is prohibited encodings, so not Web of Everywhere. And I like the fact that the computer has a tape input, which is pretty old school. Doug didn't send me any cover art, but he did point me to a cover artist, Boris Vallejo, and I've chosen a couple of his covers. The first one is an Eric John Stark book from Lee Brackett, and I assume that that's Mr. Stark himself on the front with some very fierce-looking wolfy dog things. I need to read more Lee Brackett. Her writing is really excellent based on the couple that I have read. Next is another Vallejo artwork, and hooray for more spaceships. And this one I recognise, it's from the cover of Gateway by Frederick Pohl. And it's a nice cover, shame about the book, which I thought was pretty poor, well, at least disappointing. I do hear the second book is better than the first one. Still, there are spaceships, and that can't be a bad thing. Doug also suggested that I look at the Ace editions of E.C. Tubbs' Dumerus books from the early 1980s, and I do agree that they're rather fabulous. They're super colourful and very interesting with lots of detail. I think my favourite of these is The Winds of Garther over on the right, which is very bright and has the obvious attraction of a minimally clad lady. A princess maybe, she's wearing a crown. I'm not sure why she's wearing so few clothes, perhaps it's very warm on that planet. And there's also an even less clad gladiator type in the background with what looks like a bucket on his head. It's probably not a bucket, it's probably a helmet, but it's a bit hard to tell. Moving on to a few Bob Pepper covers now, sent to me by Chris Spencer. Thank you, Chris. 3 dicks and an Ellison. Judging solely by these 4 images, Bob Pepper seems to have specialised in heads attached to varying degrees to their body. The first one is a PKD, a Maze of Death, and this poor sod doesn't seem to have much flesh left on his skull. I really like this one, the 3 stigmata of Palmer Eldritch. This guy, as well as a sharp suit, seems to have bat wings, plus there's the 3 rays shooting out of his head. Not to mention the buggy eyes. It's pretty trippy, but then it is a pretty trippy book. Sticking with the Bob Pepper covers, this is another unattached head or skull plugged into some device or other. Again, it's wacky stuff. And actually this cover is also a favourite of Rick's, and more to come from him later. The final Bob Pepper is another PKD, a Scanner Darkly this time, and once again the head is wired in, albeit still attached to its body this time. Look at his eyes. How many eyes does one person need? Again, pretty wacky cover. Mojo prompted me to look at some A. Van Vogt covers, some of which I actually have on my shelves and I really like, but I must have forgotten to look at my V to Z shelf when I was preparing my video last week. Anyway, these are marvellous, all Bruce Pennington, I believe. I'm beginning to think that a serious science fiction fan might almost be obliged to collect every book with a Pennington cover on it. They are, without exception, fantastic. Look at this one, The Pawns of Nallet in the Sphere edition, I think. This is my favourite of the Van Vogt covers we're going to look at. Lots of bold colours. On the other hand, I also like this one, The Battle of Forever, which is all shades of one tone of red. If you look at his face, he looks like one of those blue fellas off of James Cameron's Avatar movies, only with snake hair and red, not blue. The world of Nallet is also gorgeous, also in the Sphere. This time with more pastel shades, which I think is more typical of Pennington's work. It does look a bit washed out, but if you stare at it and look more closely, there's really loads of detail in there and plenty to see, and it's still very beautiful. Finally, from Van Vogt and Brucey Boy, we have The Weapon Makers, which has some actual flying saucers on it, as well as a shapely pair of legs. And then there's The Silky, which this time has a near-naked fella on the front, just for a change. These New English Library books from the 1970s are something special. That I had a few in my video last week. I really need to find an exhaustive list of them so I can get busy collecting them. If you know of such a thing, then let me know. Paul Campbell, another regular viewer, has quite a few covers to share, starting with Distant Stars by Samuel Delaney, with an astronaut stepping through a hatch or an airlock, perhaps. I'm not sure when that issue was printed. It has a look at the 1980s about it, or maybe even the 90s. Ghostlight by Fritz Lieber is next, a collection of short stories with a bit of autobiography thrown in. The cover illustration is interesting, pretty understated compared to some. There's the obligatory, attractive, sexy even lady in bed this time, and she's clearly forgotten her pyjamas. Don't you hate it when that happens? But there's also, if you look closely and aren't too distracted by the sexy lady, there's also a chess piece, a bubble, and an origami bird. I assume that they're relevant in some way to one or more of the stories in the book, but who knows? Still with Paul, we're on to an Ursula Le Guin now, Always Coming Home, which has a nice bucolic scene which looks like an alpine summer somewhere in Switzerland, but I'm sure it isn't. I expect it's on another planet somewhere. Approaching Oblivion next, and I have this book in the pan lozenge style on the left, which has a dirty great big spaceship on the front. And in contrast, Paul's favoured edition on the right has a professional businesswoman dangling from a floating island. And those are two quite different takes on a cover illustration for the same book. Next are two books that I cover myself with Michael Whelan covers. These two Larry Niven books are very handsome indeed. I do have a soft spot for that 1980s vibe. I don't know much about the story of either of them, but they seem to involve some very big trees and Peter Pan, or possibly an elfin Robin Hood, at least as far as the integral trees is concerned. And The Smoke Ring is the sequel and also a stunner, and I particularly like The Flying Shark. And what is that lady wearing on her feet? They look like homemade flippers. I've no idea what's going on in either of them, but in both cases they're covers that make me want to read the book. Paul's final selection is a Clarke, Fountains of Paradise, in the pan but not in the lozenge format. To me it looks like something you might find in a Batman movie, the entrance to some evil villain's lair. Rick sent me a few to share. Thank you, Rick. Earth Abides by George Stewart is first up. I read this some years back and found it rather beautiful, but also sad and somewhat tragic at the end. The cover art here seems to be trying to capture some permanence for education, chiselling numbers into a stone while the uncomprehending look on. Next is a personal favourite of mine, Samuel Delaney's Nova in the Bantam. I have Dahlgren in the same livery and it's very nice too. Not only is it a nice cover art, but Nova is a good quality space opera too, so I'm doubly keen to find a copy of my own. It'll turn up at some point, I expect. I do love the red and orange tones, and there's a wasteland and of course a spaceship or two as well. I want to read it just based on the image, and I think that is probably job number one for the cover art. Catch the eye, sure, but also make me want to read the book. Next from Rick is Stanislav Lem's Solaris in the Berkeley. I initially thought that the purple lines on the cover were pen marks on his copy, but no. On closer inspection, that is part of the illustration. I reckon they're purple clouds or something. Solaris is another book that I'm yet to read. I thought it was about a group of researchers in orbit above a sentient gelatinous ocean, which isn't really coming through from the cover art, I must be honest. Still, it's a nice cover. Rick's next choice is Songs of Distant Earth by Arthur C. Clarke. I like the way that the moons are lined up with the radio telescope dish, with the horizon cutting through it. It's very pleasing and geometrically aligned. Finally, from Rick, we have Wolfbane, which is a Pole Kornbluth collaboration. I have this book on my shelves in that very dull penguin from the late 1960s on the left, so that's my book, which is really boring in comparison to one that Rick sent me, which is on the right. Again, there's a lot going on in this artwork. I'm much more curious about this story than I was based on my boring-looking edition, which hardly evokes alien invasion and the subjugation of Earth. Stacey wanted to share a couple of graphic novel covers. I'm not a big reader of graphic novels, although there's no good reason for that. I just never have. It's never occurred to me to do so. First, we have Not All Robots, which seems to involve some very concerned-looking people at Sunday lunch, watched over by an Art Deco-looking robot. And then there's Tin Stars, which is the first volume, it seems, of something called the Descender series. And the kid looks to me like one of the AI hybrid robot things from the recent movie The Creator. Torsten urged me to check out any covers that I liked by Ron Turner, and on checking there are many Ron Turner covers. I picked two slightly at random, and we're deep in pulp magazine territory here. Vargo Stanton, by the way, is a pen name for John Russell Fearn, who was a prolific Brit who wrote mainly for the US market, including crime and westerns as well as science fiction. I love these covers, which are as vivid as Vargo's writing allegedly is. Torsten also wanted me to know that his preference for female cover stars was for a form-hugging spacesuit, such as appears on these two Venus Prime books, and I can see what he means. That's it. Thank you everyone that sent me cover art or pointed me to an artist. I really appreciate it, and I hope you enjoyed watching. Which ones did you like best? Do let me know in the comments. It'd be fun to find out. As always, thank you for watching, and until next time, goodbye for now.